Hi there, I'm Barbara Anderson. Welcome to the Pressure Point. The word shalom is an often used greeting, by a Hebrew greeting that's now often used by Christians as well. But its meaning in the biblical sense was much more significant. Tonight we explore the meaning of shalom with our special guest, the Reverend Dr. Donald Grayston, Director of the Shalom Institute in Burnaby. Welcome to the Pressure Point, Don.
Thanks very much, Barbara.
Tell us first of all, Don, what is the Shalom Institute?
The Shalom Institute is a national ecumenical organization that tries to connect spirituality with education for justice and peace ministry. That may seem like a long definition, but
Sounds like a mouthful.
I had to get all those terms in there. Each one of them really does mean something.
Just go back again. A national?
Well, it's national, yes. It's a Canada-wide organization. Our national office, indeed our only office, but still the national office, is in Burnaby, and we work across the country. In fact, I've just come back this week from Halifax, where I visited 2 theological schools and did some work for the Anglican House of Bishops. And it's ecumenical. It's concerned with all churches. Our board is fully ecumenical, and we work with theological schools of all Christian persuasions.
When you say ecumenical, we're looking at a very broad spectrum here, not just, for instance, the mainline churches? Or
Yes, we have, on our board, we have a Mennonite, and we have a Baptist, and although some Baptists are more mainline than others, as I discovered from my visit to Acadia this last week in Nova Scotia. Roman Catholics, Anglicans, United Church people, Presbyterians, and so on.
And located in Burnaby. Now, tell us when and why it was first established.
Well, it was first officially established in September 1985, which means we're just a little more than 2 years old. But the idea for it came in 1983 during the World Council of Churches. I was on the committee that had prepared the Plowshares Coffee House, and I floated at the coffee house and talked to people who came there to one or another of our presentations on justice and peace. And a lot of the people that I met were pastors, and I would have a kind of typical conversation after a presentation. The pastor would say, "This is important stuff," and I would agree, and then usually he, occasionally she, would say, "You know, when I went to theological school, I didn't get any of this stuff." Pause. "I wonder what they're doing at theological school right now." And I would say, "Well, I really don't know, but I agree it is important." "Well, nice talking to you." And I guess I had that conversation 25 or 30 times. Then I talked to Ernie Regier from Project Plowshares, which is the Canadian Council of Churches peace coalition with a focus on disarmament and development. And I asked him, had Project Plowshares ever tried to make a special outreach towards theological schools? And he said no. They had thought of it, but they didn't have the staff, the time, the money, and so on. And I asked him, should somebody do it? And he said, oh yeah, somebody should do it. And at that point, the Shalom Institute was conceived in August 1983, and it took us 2 years to put it together.
That's interesting. So you asked the question, and it became a rather rhetorical one. Should somebody do it?
I guess I was already thinking, well, say yes, Ernie, I really want to do it.
Well, let's just go back now. We talked about the word shalom at the introduction. Why do you use the word shalom and not peace? I mean, peace is often in many of our organizations for peace, but you've chosen a particular word.
Well, yes, because peace is an English word, people who speak English think that they already know what the word peace means, so they can use it in mutually contradictory ways sometimes. For example, peace is our present political situation, which is the result of two power blocks threatening each other with nuclear deterrence. That's peace, is it? Or peace is the good relationship that I have with somebody else, or it's the inner feeling that I have in my relationship with God. Or is it a world in which the power blocks have gone and the universal availability of justice means that there is peace among peoples and between peoples and so on? Well, in fact, a lot of those meanings are present in the word shalom, but by using the word shalom, you have the opportunity to unpack it a little, because people think they know what it means, but very often they'll ask the question, what does it really mean?
Well, as you say too, I mean, peace is it's almost like the word love. It's been overused, and I mean, there are some things now that we now call missiles peacekeepers.
Right, and peacemakers. And
peacemakers,
so
I guess, is the word, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the word shalom, does it not have a broader sense, like you were mentioning justice in there, and does
Yes.
that not include justice as
Absolutely.
well as simply peace?
Yeah. There's a new book out, which I've just skimmed. I haven't read the whole thing, but it's by an American Mennonite, Perry Yoder, and the title of the book is Shalom, the Bible's word for salvation, justice, and peace. So in other words, it includes the dimension of personal wholeness, relationship with God, and relationship with other people, and it includes the justice dimension, the doing of the will of the just God, and it also includes what we think of as peace, but it sees peace as the fruit of justice, and also the fruit of salvation, if salvation is our relationship with God and the relationship that comes about with other people because of our relationship with God.
So it has a really much broader definition and connotation.
That's right.
When did your interest in peace begin, your own personal journey towards peace or peace education?
I think there were a number of significant moments. One very particular one was in, I think it was October or November 1980, my wife said to me, "Are you going to be on one of the committees for the World Council of Churches Assembly preparation?" And I said, yeah, have they got one on peace and war and militarism, that kind of stuff? And she said, yes, phone Kathleen Wallace Deering, 733-0141. And I was almost astonished at myself, at hearing myself say those words, because until she asked the question, I hadn't really thought that I was concerned about peace. But at that moment, I realized that subconsciously I had been taking in a tremendous amount of anxiety from the media and from our society in general. This was the time when Ronald Reagan had just been elected or was about to be elected. There was a lot of rhetoric about limited nuclear war, which I knew to be an absolute contradiction in terms. And I realized that on the unconscious level, I had been absorbing a lot of fear and anxiety. And I don't think that was a unique experience. I think that very many people in our society do that, particularly children.
Yeah, and so it was at that point that you realized that you had a concern.
Yeah, and I had to act on it. And I found that what I really had to do was to work through a lot of that anxiety and fear and anger at the things that were causing me fear that I had picked up. And it took me a couple of years really to work through that. I think that by the time of the assembly, I had to a large extent work through that. From time to time, I think I have to go back and, in a sense, rekindle a little of that anger, because there is a lot to be angry about. And yet, the basic approach of the Christian in the peace movement, which, again, using the word peace there, is something much larger than the disarmament movement, which is a very specific part of the peace movement. I think the basic Christian attitude has to be one that gets its energy from faith and grace and truth, some of these big words and big realities behind those big words, rather than fear and anger.
When you worked on that committee for the World Council of Churches, did you meet other people from other countries, other Christians who shared a similar kind of view that you had?
Yes and no. I think that most of the people that we invited from other countries to make presentations at the coffee house were people with a much better developed understanding of Shalom than I had at the time. And they were mostly people who were involved in justice movements in their own countries, like, Julia Esquivel from Guatemala and so on. John Howard Yoder from the United States. And so listening to these people, my own concept of both peace and shalom had to expand. One funny thing is that when I was ordained in the Anglican Church in 1963, I used a little card for my ordination card that Anglicans send out to their friends to say, you know, come to the ordination and pray and give presents and things like that. I used a little card which was the first line of the prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. But as I look back on it now, this was just kind of a pious wish. It was a neat little card. And I was really thinking of it in what I would now see as a somewhat narrowly spiritual or narrowly evangelical point of view. That is, the important thing is being saved and salvation and peace with God. And of course that is important. But in that book title that I mentioned, that's the first term of 3 terms. It doesn't exist by itself. So now I'd be ready to say, sure, peace with God, but there is no peace with God, no salvation, no wholeness without justice and peace.
And no salvation for then the individual without the rest of the community
That's
being
right.
part of that?
That's right. There is no such thing as, I would categorically say, there's no such thing as individual salvation. There is personal salvation, but that's something different.
How do you differentiate those two?
Well, the individual is, in the literal meaning of the word, somebody who's divided off from the group. But the person, you're only a person in the community of other persons. You cannot be a person alone. If you're brought up, you know, dumped on a desert island and dropped food packages, you will never grow up to be a person because your personhood will not have been drawn out of you by interaction with other persons.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it. I have heard people say that there is no individual salvation, but they haven't gone on to say that there is personal salvation.
Oh, yes.
So that's interesting. Well, you have studied the life and works of Thomas Merton. How has that influenced your views on salvation and shalom and justice and so on? Peace?
Well, there's a very direct connection with what we were just saying. Those terms, individual and person, really come straight out of Thomas Merton. He was influenced by the French personalist theologians of the 1920s and 30s, and he makes these distinctions between what he calls the individual, or the false self, and the person, or the true self. So the person is who we are in God. The individual is who we are without God. If we're not interested in God, or we ignore God, or we shut God out, then that's the act of the individual.
Well, is there anything more about Thomas Merton that has influenced?
Oh yes, that really in his own spirituality and his own writings, he brought these two currents together. I guess if you look into what we're trying to do in the Shalom Institute, we're trying to bring two currents of Christian energy together. One is the spirituality current, and the other is the justice and peace current. Now those are completely integrated in Thomas Merton. I remember some nights around 1 or 2 in the morning when I was working on my dissertation, I would be typing away, and all of a sudden I'd think, oh, this is good stuff. One of these days I'm going to have to take cognizance of this personally. And so it happened. And I think it's no accident that it happened for me when it did, because I had just finished my PhD about 2 or 3 months before, and this huge weight was off my life. And for the first time in a number of years, I could look around and listen and keep my eyes open and take something in from the world. And what I took in was its need for true peace, true shalom.
Thomas Merton was an American monk who, died in what year?
1968.
1968. So he's fairly recent, fairly much a contemporary of this age.
That's right.
And yet, did he not take a vow of silence for a number of years?
Well, he was a member of the Trappist community,
yes.
And the Trappist community among Roman Catholic religious communities was noted for its dedication to silence. They had a very highly developed sign language with about 400 signs that they would use instead of uttering words. And from what I've read about it, you could gabble and gossip just as easily in sign language as you could using your mouth. But after the Second Vatican Council, they mitigated their rule of silence, and they're much more relaxed about it now. Less obsessional, one might say, than they seemed to be before. But yet silence is still, in the Trappist Cistercian community, a very profound religious value, because it's It's a lead-in to the contemplative life in which one opens oneself in a very particular way to God.
Well, and it's interesting, as you say, that those two currents that you see coming together in Thomas Merton and that you are trying to bring together at the Shalom Institute are often diverging. They
right.
don't often come together.
Uh-huh.
Why is that? Why do we often see a very action-oriented group of Christians working towards peace and justice without much of that contemplative or reflective kind of viewpoint of life? And then the other group who may seem to be so otherworldly, they don't want to be interested in the
That's right. Over here in this corner wearing the white trunks are the spirituality folks, and over here wearing the black trunks are the justice and peace folks, and they don't talk to each other very often. Well, I think perhaps it's because it's a lot easier to take one approach and concentrate on that approach than it is to balance and integrate two things. I think that very often, particularly in the first half of our life, if we're good at school, we go on the thinking path, or if we are good at feeling and relations with other people, we go on that path. But there does come a certain point in our life when we realize the parts of our personality that are undeveloped and that really need to be developed if we're going to be a whole person. So if a Christian is going to be a whole person, or if the church is going to be a whole community, a community that is whole in itself, it's going to have to develop both its inner side and its outer side. If we only exist externally and we're hollow inside, then obviously there's something wrong. But human beings seem to have trouble doing more than one thing at once in any depth. And I really think it is a developmental thing that brings these things together. But ultimately, they really do have to come together.
There's a course that you offer at the Shalom Institute called Prophetic Spirituality. Have I got that right?
Yes, well, the full title is Thomas Merton and Prophetic Spirituality.
What do you mean by prophetic spirituality? How is spirituality prophetic?
Well, our spirituality is the way we relate to God, self, and others. That's there's tons of definitions of spirituality, but that's one that I typically use. And we are brought up, we're acculturated in our Christian community, our Christian culture, to relate to ourself and to God and to others in particular ways. Now, the way I was brought up in the Anglican Church, it was never suggested to me that my way of being a Christian needed to include anything to do with justice and peace. So what we're trying to suggest to people is that it's essential for all Christians in some way or other to include a concern for justice and peace within their spirituality. And that, of necessity, will make them prophetic in our society, because to be concerned about justice and peace is to see its lack and to need to speak out about it.
What about the role of prayer in your vision of that justice and peace and spirituality coming together? Now, is prayer a kind of connective tissue in that?
Yeah, that's a very good term for it. I guess it has to do with the nature of the God that Christians worship. The God that we worship in Christ through the Spirit is the just God and the peaceful God. Both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament say Yahweh is our peace. Christ is our peace. And God is also the just one, the one who justifies us by faith. This is justification by faith, and it's the action of the just God that does that. So prayer is, from one point of view, again there's 100 points of view, prayer is the way we bond with the just and peacemaking God. And if that's who God is, then by bonding with God, we have to take that concern for justice and peace into ourselves. We can't say, well, God, I want all the rest of you, but I don't want the justice and peace stuff. That's too complicated or too stressful. God says, here I am, I'm all of a piece, and you got to take me as I am, all of me.
And so we really need to be open to that side of God that we may not have been open to before.
Yeah, I think that we grow up typically in our mainline Christian North American culture, believing that God is love. And God is love. But God is also justice and mercy and righteousness and truth. And as our life goes on, if we're growing as Christians, we learn how to incorporate these other aspects of the wholeness of God, the shalom of God, into our own human, personal shalom.
How would ministers or students who take courses at the Shalom Institute or who work with you in these areas differ from others who don't when they come out? If someone goes into the Shalom Institute, says, okay, I'm going to bring these two currents together in my own life, and they come out of some kind of study with you, how are they going to differ from theological students, say, who haven't taken that route or who have neglected that aspect of their seminary life?
Well, they, I think, will be people who, I hope, see in a new way the immensity of it all and the need for integration, the need for balance. I think that a lot of pastors that I know, and we don't just deal with pastors, ordained members of the ministry, we work with lay ministers, people, ordinary members of the church who are conscious that they have a ministry in the area of justice and peace, but who struggle with bringing those currents together. I think in the church it's a lot easier to decide, well, I'm good at youth work and I'll just do youth work and that's all I'm going to do. Or I'm good at prayer, so I'll pray and that's all I'm going to do. But to strive for balance, for wholeness, for integration, and to be conscious that that's a lifetime effort, a lifetime struggle, and it's not just pain and misery, it's an opportunity of great richness and reward, but always with the consciousness that you're never finished.
Well, it's interesting too that often we put ourselves in those pigeonholes and other people put us in those pigeonholes too. That person's good at this. They're good at praying, or they're good at peace and justice issues, but we don't want them to come and talk to us about the spiritual aspect and so on.
That's right. And have you ever noticed how some people, at least in the church, will do one thing, do their thing, the thing that the church affirms them in, for 15 or 20 years, and then suddenly disappear, burn out? I think that the activists, the social justice folk, are more likely to find burnout than the pure spirituality folks who have a kind of an interned spirituality. Their danger is irrelevance, which is better or worse, irrelevance or burnout.
Yeah, what a choice. Well, are there similar institutes to the Shalom Institute in other parts of Canada or the U.S.? Or
I don't really think there are. I did check that out while we were putting the Shalom Institute together. Our particular constituency is theological education. So we relate particularly to theological schools and centers for continuing education, like places like Sorrento and Naramata, although I've never done anything at Naramata. And we do that on a national basis. Now, there's no similar organization in the States.
There isn't, eh?
No. There's the Association of Theological Schools, which is a binational organization for both Canada and the States, but it doesn't just deal with Shalom, it deals with finances and administration. Well, in a sense, that's all part of Shalom. You can't run anything in the direction of wholeness without money, but there's no other institute that has the same kind of focus that we do. There is an organization that I just ran across a while ago in Wisconsin, of which Parker Palmer is the director, and judging from their blurb, it seems that their focus is very much what ours is, but again, they're a center and people come to them from whatever source, whereas part of what we do is an attempt to be a network or a linkage among theological schools in Canada.
And you, of course, do a lot of traveling out to other, as you say, other theological schools. It's not so much they come to you, but you also go out to them.
That's right, yes. This last week I visited Acadia, the Baptist School in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and the Atlantic School of Theology, Anglican United Roman Catholic in Halifax. So we're trying to make some links and interact. A number of theological schools are doing some really fantastic stuff in this area. I'd say about a third. About a third are in the stage of creative guilt, where they're thinking, gee, we better do something, what are we going to do? And a third, I would say their life has not been touched by this in any lively sense.
And so they need to be starting to think about at least entering maybe the creative guilt stage or something. What's in the future now for you and for the Shalom Institute as you look down the road in the years to come?
Well, I'm hoping we'll be able to continue with our courses here in Vancouver and the kind of work we'll be doing. We do have other people besides myself, regional associates in other parts of Canada who are committed to promoting our concerns and emphases in these different areas. There's two projects we're working on at the moment which I think have a lot of potential. One is a Pacific Northwest program, an extension program in spiritual direction, that is the training of people to be spiritual mentors, spiritual guides, and who in doing that on a one-to-one basis or in groups will be able to integrate the justice and peace concern within their spirituality.
You're training them to be mentors or guides to theological students? Or?
To anybody,
Okay.
yes, to theological students, to pastors, to lay people who are struggling in their own life to grow as Christians in both dimensions, the prayer dimension and the justice dimension, and trying to keep those two together. There are spiritual directors around, I think a number who perhaps their formation has not led them to see the importance of justice and peace. And then there are some justice and peace people around, educators, who don't know how to deal with the prayer side of things. So this is, we're hoping to start this next summer. We're working on it with the Center for Spiritual Development in Seattle and hoping to have some good connections with VST and Regent as well.
Well, that's interesting. So you're really broadening that whole perspective. How can people get in touch with the Shalom Institute?
By writing us at 3821 Lister Street in Burnaby, V5G 2B9, or by phoning us at 433-2599.
And they can find out more information through brochures or something?
Sure. We have material we'd be glad to send people.
Well, thanks very much for being our guest tonight on The Pressure Point, Don. We wish you all the best as you and the Shalom Institute continue in that work, that important work of combining those two currents and bringing shalom to not only theological students but to the lives of other people, lay ministers in the church as well.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. And we thank you for joining us on The Pressure Point. Thank you. Shalom.